have this going on again.
RFI 156 sauce.
단발보단 긴 머리가 좋아요.
Wait, that shit's called 157 sauce? God damn it. What joke am I supposed to do with 156? Anyways, it's still RFI. It's still death metal. This week, we are going to one of the originators of a particular subsection of the genre I enjoy very much. This week, of course, we will be talking about Autopsy, who were an important early death metal band that are still around today and still putting out good stuff as far as I'm concerned. Autopsy, most people associate them with the drummer slash vocalist slash major songwriter Chris Reifert, who was introduced to the metal community on the first Death album. That, of course, being the timeless classic Scream Bloody Gore. I'm sure everybody's already familiar with this album. I'm sure there's plenty of out there that'll try to tell you that this album sucks and Later Death is better. Those people are wrong. This is good stuff. And part of why it's good is because you got these cool kind of very punk-influenced drum lines coming from Chris Reifert. Certainly it's a bit more staid and prosaic compared to like the really wacky shit he would do with Autopsy, but you can still kind of feel his influence in the band, even a little bit. But he didn't last long in death. See, at this time, Chuck Schuldiner was running around being a member of a handful of bands trying to help invent death metal. He was in Repulsion for a while, he was in Slaughter for a while, and then he moved it to San Francisco and started up a new version of Death with Chris Reifert on drums. Ended up moving back to Florida. Chris Reifert went with him for one summer, decided it was hot and humid down there for him, so he moved back to San Francisco, met up with Eric Cutler and Danny Corrales, and started Autopsy, and the rest is history. Unlike my exceptionally autistic
autism, what is that really? Let's find out.
Episode on Asphyx, we're not going to cover all the demos because pretty much every song from those demos was re-recorded with the same band members on their subsequent albums or on EPs or whatever, and like the newer versions of those songs are unilaterally just way better than the demos. So they put out some demos, they get signed to Peaceville, and they put out some stuff that might sound familiar to you even if you don't know Autopsy that well. Like, hey, you over there, you like death metal?
해보겠습니다.
Of course you do. You like Swedish death metal? Of course you do. Who doesn't like that? It's the stuff that goes like, you know, good stuff. A lot of people will tell you that that sound started with Entombed back when they were called Nihilist, when they put out demos like this. This is from a 1998 demo entitled Only Shreds Remain. The song's Abnormally Deceased. I'm sure you people already fucking knew that, but what if I told you that in 1986, there was a Canadian band called Slaughter that put out stuff that sounded like this? Like, I don't know, that sounds pretty darn similar to what would later on become Swedish death metal to me, at least in terms of guitar sound aesthetics. Also, that's a really good album. You should check out Slaughter Strapato if you haven't. But what if I were then to explain to you that according to Entombed themselves, they came up with the idea for that guitar sound thanks to a band called Deviated Instinct, who are a crust band from the UK playing stuff like this. Now this, if you've heard the Nihilist demos, this Deviated Instinct album sure sounds a hell of a lot like that, not only in terms of guitar sound, but also their particular emphasis on groove. However, this episode is not about Deviated Instinct.
No.
It is not about Entombed.
No.
It's not about Slaughter.
No.
It's about fucking Autopsy. Who, if I may indulge in a bit of a hot take here, and I know I'm not the first person to say this, are actually the greatest Swedish death metal band, even though they are not from Sweden.
What the actual fuck did you just say to me right now?
I say that because this first Autopsy album ironed out pretty much the entire approach to the subgenre of what would become Swedish death metal years before any of the classic Swedish death metal albums were already recorded. It's got the buzzy guitar tone, it has the emphasis on groove, but it also has these weird little aesthetic things, like little bits of wackiness that would later become heavily associated with Swedish death metal. For example, that thing where the right channel guitar does the chainsaw noise and the left channel guitar plays little percussive bits in time with the drums that you hear on like all the Swedish albums. That started on this album. This is the last song on the first Autopsy album. It's called Stillborn, and it's fucking great. You might also notice that the bass on this album is particularly prominent. That's because they have bass playing from Steve DiGiorgio from Sadist, who later on joined Death for a bit. Those are Chris's vocals. He's doing them while he is drumming, and they are excellent. But yeah, like, that guitar sound had been around, but nobody had really like just chainsawed it out like that before, with the really long, drawn-out tremolo pick chords from one guitar, and then the other guitar using a slightly different distortion, but still buzzy, sort of like an encasing factor over it, while playing more percussive riffs. That starts with Autopsy, as far as I can tell, and it's great. But Autopsy did not only influence all of your favorite Swedish death metal bands like Dismember and Entombed and whatnot. By the way, there's a band from the mid-90s called Murder Squad that's basically half of Dismember, half of Entombed, Chris Reifert doing guest stuff, and it's amazing. Check that out if you get the chance. But anyways, not just the Swedish guys. You might remember back on the first Osfix episode, we talked about the song Vermin. It's the one that had the triple breakdown in it. That was one of the only new songs they wrote for their 1991 debut album, The Rack. You still giggling about that?
Shameful display!
But the fact that that song was written specifically for that album means it was written in like 1990, and it has the triple breakdown where you got some tremolo riffs that gradually change over the course of the song, and each time there's a tremolo riff change, it's punctuated by a very nasty breakdown. Well, the first song on this first Autopsy album, which came out in 1989, also invented that technique.
No! Autopsy.
Did it!
Autopsy.
Did it! Ah! Don't have a cow, man!
The song's called Charred Remains, and it's great. It's one of my favorite Autopsy songs. When we get to the fast part, you can notice a little bit of lingering influence from that first Death album kind of spooking around with how these riffs are done. But it has a bit more of like a weird kind of sloppy groove to it than anything you would hear in Death, which is what I think makes Autopsy unique. But once we get through that, we get into the first breakdown, and it is spectacular. I really like how loud Steve's bass is on this album. It gives everything kind of an extra bite. It's a very punchy sound. But yeah, no, that's a great mid-paced bit there. You know, it keeps going on like that. Eventually we get back into the faster part, and we get a nice variant on that opening riff back there, that more percussive one. Now it's given a little bit more fluid motion. And we get into a newer version of the fast riff. A little bit more tense sounding. Very well-written song in terms of dynamics. But this breakdown coming up, this is my favorite of the three because it's not as kind of like weird and groovy. It's more just like very sharp. Like it hits very hard, especially with that bass helping out. Really dig the shit out of that riff. And so you think, okay, you know, that might be where they end the song. No, motherfucker.
No!
Great fast riffs as always. And we utilize that same technique where we introduce a breakdown with a very nasty Chris Reifert noise. And this one kind of shows where they would go later on in their career. Because this one is like almost a very perverted and gore-soaked version of like a Black Sabbath riff. So that's really cool. But yeah, Severed Survival, the first Autopsy album, it's essential. Go and get it. And then we get to the Transitional EP, which shares a lot of similar features with the Transitional EP between Entombed's first two albums. If anybody's ever heard that, it was called Crawl, and it was great. The first song on it, the title track, which would later be re-recorded for the second Entombed album, shows off their new style pretty well. It's a little bit like groovier, more slowed down. Also, it has vocals from Orvar Safstrom from Nirvana 2002, and I think he's actually my favorite Entombed vocalist.
Wow!
The final track of the EP is a re-recording of an older song, showing off how they can take their older material and spice it up with their new aesthetic innovations and such. So this one's Bitter Loss. It's a great song. Everybody knows it. But then, for the middle track on the EP, there is a song that has never appeared anywhere since. It's called Forsaken. And it's actually one of my favorite Entombed songs, and I think the fact that it's only on this like little... Actually, it's more of a 7-inch than an EP. This thing's fucking short. It's only on that, and that's kind of why I like it. It's really cool. It's a good deal more frenzied sounding than most of their stuff. before or after it. But in all three of those songs, I think you heard a lot of Autopsy influence. But also, this EP is serving as a very effective model of what a transitional EP between two major albums could sound like. Autopsies, which came out first, is very similar. Instead of having one new song, one old song, and then one unique song, this one has one unique song and two new songs that would change substantially on the full length. But overall, it provides an effective snapshot of where Autopsy were pushing their sound, and they certainly were pushing it in a new direction. The doom metal component that was somewhat prominent on their debut album is now taking center stage, at least on this song, the title track, Retribution of the Dead, utilizing Black Sabbath style tritones and little like hammer-on pull-off trill things like this one right here. Yeah. Also, there are full stops. Much more aggressive use of full stops than on the previous full length. Also, for a band that pretty much invented this Swedish death metal compositional milieu, they've abandoned it very quickly. The guitars are still buzzy, but it's a lot more like humid sounding, and it's not as like in your face and aggressive as their early stuff. They've pretty much just gone into their own style after inventing another style that all these bands ran with. Also, this solo is really cool. This like weird, decrepit lead with all of its dissonance and nastiness. But then we get to the songs that would later on be reworked for the second Autopsy full length. This one's called In the Grip of Winter. It first shows up on the Retribution for the Dead EP, and then is later reworked on the full-length album, Mental Funeral. And you could tell the production here is exceptionally strange and alienated. Also, the drums are a lot weirder. He does a lot more like weird kind of Bill Ward of death metal type tom rolls and shit. Really cool stuff. And these new harmonies. The harmonies are now an important part of Autopsy sound and are very unsettling sounding. Definitely not standard mellow death harmonies. And they're utilizing a lot more negative space since there is quite a bit more doom metal going on here. I think this sounds like it was recorded in the 70s almost. It's a very odd sound for a death metal album, but it works for this kind of really eerie shit, and I love it. Just really, like, groovy, but not in the standard sort of, like, party rock way. This shit is more lurching than groovy, I guess, if that makes sense. And that's why Mental Funeral is probably my favorite Autopsy album, just because it sounds so different from pretty much everything else on the death metal market. Speaking of things that are different, we have instrumental interludes, like this one right here, Flesh Crawl. No drums, just these weird droning guitars. This almost sounds like the Burzum of death metal with that one weird drone note, and then this sort of like spookier kind of doom metal thing going on the other stereo channel. Really cool stuff like this. There's a couple of these, and they're both great. Zaster, of all bands, actually covered this weird little interlude section, so you could tell this shit influenced black metal in addition to the weirder sides of death metal, and it's great. It also smoothly transitions into Torn from the Womb, which is another really unsettling, more doomy song on this album, utilizing those same kind of like weird diminished chords and chromatic scales to play these like Alfred Hitchcock soundtrack type riffs. They're really good. Full stop and boom. You gotta love when a death metal vocalist just busts out that really prolonged, really good stuff. And the drums are doing all this like cool, very Sabbathy shit. Other influences on this album, if you read the interview in the booklet or the reissue, they were actually pretty big into like Frank Zappa and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, much like the Seized, who were doing similarly strange things in death metal at the time. But yeah, no, Torn from the Womb, great song. Another full stop. And more just like weird shit with these rolling drums, like multiple layers of guitars doing all kinds of interesting things. That probably influenced At the Gates a lot too. But speaking of when I said earlier, that shit was almost like the Burzum of death metal. I don't know if Autopsy specifically influenced Burzum. I know they did influence Paradise Lost a lot, and Varg said that the first Paradise Lost album was one of his favorite death metal albums that he'd still listen to on occasion. And Autopsy's fingerprints are all over Lost Paradise, so there you go. But there was one Norwegian band that were unquestionably black metal at the time this album came out that wore their Autopsy influences on their sleeves, and that band was gosh darn Dark Throne, who of course are one of the greatest bands of all time. But yeah, check out this tritone riff right here. This is total Autopsy worship, and it goes into some really cool thrashy stuff. And those drums, very much sounding a lot like Autopsy. In fact, Dark Throne loved Autopsy so much, that's the reason they sent their demo to Peaceville back when they were still a death metal band. They wanted to be on the same label as them. More of that weird kind of waltzing tritone shit with a dissonant, odd, sort of anti-solo, you know? But yeah, no, Autopsy all over early Dark Throne, and even occasionally it crops up in like later Dark Throne at unexpected places. Both Nocturnal Culto and Fenris have contributed to the liner notes for a lot of the reissued Autopsy albums over the years, and in Chris Reifert and Danny Corrales' post-Autopsy band Abscess, you got Nocturnal Culto and Fenris providing guest vocals. But back to Autopsy. The album ends with a final full-length song entitled Dark Crusade, which then like seamlessly fades into the final interlude, which is entitled Mental Funeral. I love the interludes on this album because they're not like the ones on that Pestilence album where it's just a bunch of weird noises. It's actually just more music done in a more compact format, perhaps showing off kind of a bit of a grindcore influence that might be important later on. But right now we got more of that weird sort of lurching, like thrash, tribal drumming kind of shit that you only really get from Autopsy, especially back in like 1992 when this came out. And yeah, here we go. The final riff of the album is a spooky sort of tritone thing stuck on the end of a very caveman type riff, which fully encapsulates their sound. If you were to do their sound in like 5 notes, this is what Autopsy sounds like. And now we're going into the final interlude, Mental Funeral, where we have an acoustic guitar playing this really weird tritone sort of like horror movie melody. Perfect way to cap off the album, having the last song fade into something spooky and strange like that. And it's also a perfect way to cap off our Autopsy episode.
진짜 저번에 해외 꼭 그렇게 가고 싶다 했는데 같이 못 가가지고.
Don't worry, there's going to be another episode. After basically inventing the Swedish death metal archetype and then abandoning it to create some really weird new stuff that went on to influence a whole bunch of different bands from At the Gates to goddamn Dark Throne, Autopsy were not content to rest on their laurels. They kept developing their sound. And I know like the standard death metal elitist take is Autopsy's first 2 albums are great, and after that, you know, it's just like whatever. No! While Mental Funeral is probably my favorite Autopsy album, some of their best stuff was yet to come with their albums that came out after that one, and that's where we're going to pick up next time.
That's our cutest canoe!
Oh, that was a bad burp. That was giving me acid reflux. I don't know why, but I get acid reflux from everything. Just getting these stomach aches and shit. It's all part about being fat. Your body takes in all that food, whether it's good food or bad food, squishes it together because you like both. I'm not picky here, except for some people's cooking. I just rather live without that. Yeah.